Political diversity in comics. You mean it's a good idea for everyone not to share the exact same worldview? If only someone, anyone, just some guy, had suggested this for years. It looks like CBR stumbled upon an argument people have made for years, that the comic book industry needs political diversity. This is something CBR would never have published a couple of years ago, but now I think it's obvious to even the most hardcore progressives that only hiring people who agree with every one of your political views leads to a creatively stagnant industry. I can't think of any industry that's thrived, let alone had broad appeal, by playing into groupthink. Some industries might experience a certain level of financial success. The Christian music scene comes to mind, but anytime people create an environment where only one set of ideas are allowed, they cut off so much potential because great ideas often come from bucking the norm. The comic book industry itself is a testament to that. The conservatism placed on the industry by the Comics Code Authority led to the books becoming boring, sappy, and safe. Creators pushing back against the CCA in the 70s and the 80s by telling grittier, darker, and often more political stories revitalized the industry, led to greater sales, and gave us some of the best comic book stories ever. That only happened because the industry had people coming from every walk of life making comics. However, in recent years, the industry has pushed further into partisan politics. Many publishers are only interested in working with creators who share their political views and will create stories reflecting those views. This led to a severe in-group mentality among some creators, where scoring brownie points with their team was more important to them than telling interesting stories. That resulted in books riddled with half-baked political hot takes that often had nothing to do with the characters in the book, many of whom were written completely out of character. A more politically diverse environment might have curbed this, but suggesting anything like that tended to get a "shut up Nazi" response. Now, it doesn't look like the industry itself is shifting, but at least someone at Comic Book Resources realized that this one-sided partisanship doesn't help the industry. Ashley Land writes, quote, "Ever since the golden age of comics, the medium has explored the philosophies and beliefs of its superheroes. However, as the decades have progressed, the discussion of their competing beliefs of these heroes has become muted. While it is true that the competing political beliefs have been muted, this isn't an old thing. This is a fairly recent trend, one that began as the industry hired more politically motivated creators who all incidentally belonged to one side of the political spectrum. This began creeping into Marvel and DC books in the early 2010s, and by 2014 there were plenty overt examples where any politics discussed in Marvel or DC comics, and to a lesser extent all comics, always came from a far-left perspective, and with little, if any, criticism of that perspective. Books like Wonder Woman and Jane Foster's Thor come to mind, but they're hardly the only examples. At the time, people gave examples of the variety of political attitudes shared in superhero books just a few years earlier, where feminist, right-wing, religious, and anarchist characters would be taken to task for their politics. Yet here we are a decade later, and you're more likely to find examples of heroes correcting each other for referring to a villain with the wrong pronouns than any commentary on left-wing politics. If anything, you're more likely to see characters attacking strawman versions of those critiques. Again, Jane Foster's Thor comes to mind. The article goes on to say, quote, "While the ethic of some of these heroes has changed, for example, Superman's shift to political neutrality, others have maintained their beliefs throughout comic history. However, the modern age of comics has made the mistake of assigning most heroes the same safe politics, despite their histories that reflect very different beliefs." Safe politics by what standard? The politics are safe because most of the people working in the comic book industry lean to the left. If you express any of those left-leaning views in right-wing circles, you'd be cast out. The real question is why there should be any safe politics at all. Superhero stories can touch on any issue, so nothing should be off limits. It's just a matter of filtering it through the lens of that genre. The article repeats the common claim that comic books were always political, and it's true that some books were political from the start, many during World War II where they were little more than propaganda, and some in the following decades. However, the article also points out that these later political stories weren't one-sided. They feature stories that lean to the left, the right, the middle, and to no side at all, which made for more interesting tales. For example, the Hawk and Dove series was built around the lead two characters having distinctly different political views. The article lists many examples of this, from Black Panther to The Punisher, stating something that's been lost on many a modern creator. Quote, "Fans don't have to agree with these aspects of a superhero's personality, but it's good when characters have strong opinions that are relevant in the real world." This is a lesson people need to learn in general. You don't have to agree with every opinion a person has in order to interact with them, and every character you like or might like doesn't have to share your political views. It makes for more interesting stories when characters express the actual political diversity that exists in the real world, especially when filtered through the lens of the Marvel or DC landscape. What would it look like for a staunch conservative to exist in a Marvel universe with mutants running around? How would an open borders progressive deal with literal aliens from other worlds trying to immigrate to Earth? Then there are the real world issues that these heroes will obviously have strong opinions about. The article mentions DC Universe Decisions, a story based around the heroes having to deal with the fallout of Green Arrow endorsing a presidential candidate. It's an interesting concept because these heroes would obviously pick sides, and what that would mean for the landscape of the DC Universe is up for grabs. This isn't the first time DC got political. There was Steve Ditko's Hawk and Dove series that I mentioned before, and the Green Lantern Green Arrow series that was built around their political differences. That series is one of the industry's most revered comic book series. However, there is no modern equivalent of Green Lantern Green Arrow, and I don't know if there could be in this current political hyperpolarized climate. But if ever there was a need for one, this is the time, because what that series did was show both sides of an issue. Whether you agree with the characters or not, it was helpful to see what other people think and why they think it. And again, it makes for more interesting stories. The stories also don't have to be real-world street-level tales. This is where sci-fi excels because a creator can take a real-world situation, turn it into a metaphor, and run with it. The best example of this is Chris Claremont's legendary X-Men run. It's a wasted opportunity not to have a more politically diverse cast of characters, topics, and creators because, as the article says, anything else would make the stories, quote, increasingly homogenous to the point where it's a dull and predictable subject. This is exactly what's happened. This is one of the reasons why I need only see a character, hear a description, or read the pronouns in a creator's bio to know exactly what the characters and story will be like. This is also where the article kind of lies because there's this bit that clearly isn't true. Quote, thankfully, most comics don't address real-world hot-button topics much and focus on stopping villains like Joker and Green Goblin. However, virtually all major superheroes have become fairly muted and safe. That's just a lie, or maybe this is an AI-generated article, because just a few years ago, many of the major titles from Marvel and DC could not shut up about Donald Trump. Nick Spencer turned Captain America into a Hydra agent, so a Nazi, over the 2016 election. For the next 2 years, dozens of books from the big two and indie publishers fixated on this. Hell, Howard Chaykin got canceled over it, not because he sided with Trump, but because he showed what he thought would happen as a result of Trump being in office. I will repeat that, because it's so stupid you're probably too smart to understand the short version. Howard Chaykin created the book The Divided States of Hysteria as a warning about the right wing and Donald Trump and how they would escalate their attacks on groups they didn't like, trans people, Muslim immigrants, and such. So he showed this happening in the book, showed the attacks, showed them being a bad thing, and the progressives, his own side, got mad at him for showing the things they all thought would happen. To pretend that none of this happened is insane. These people were unbelievably unhinged and were hell-bent on seeing who could write the craziest progressive story. Superhero stories were definitely not muted or safe. That was at least a fifth of the books, probably closer to a third. Moving on, the article does finally get a famous Stan Lee comment right. Quote, Stan Lee used to describe Marvel Comics as the world outside your window. He wanted his heroes to have relatable, even mundane problems. Yes, that's what that statement means. That who the characters are, what they do, how they think and behave, and what they address should match what we see in the real world. That would make them more relatable and believable, and that should and would include their political beliefs. The reason is because people's politics and personalities are intertwined, and when dealing with big, often world-ending issues, those views would naturally come out and drive the characters' actions. It doesn't make sense that you wouldn't see that, especially in modern comics which are written for an adult audience. These concepts come up in every other medium, so why not comics? And why not in superhero comics, where these people are often working outside or alongside, but rarely with the law? The types of people who would do that would likely have strong opinions they couldn't and wouldn't keep to themselves. We should see that political diversity in the books, and the way to do that is by increasing the political diversity among the comic book creators. The article doesn't get into that, but this is probably the reason for the lack of political diversity in the stories. People tend to write what they know and what they're interested in, so if everyone creating books leans to one side of the political spectrum, you're going to end up with unbalanced storytelling. If these companies hire more people who aren't politically aligned with them, they will naturally get more politically diverse stories. Yes, some of those stories will turn some people off. Some of the creators might turn people off. That's fine. That's why you hire people from diverse backgrounds and opinions. That way you're bound to have something for everyone. The other is that it gets the creators working with people who may not share their views, and that collaboration may change their opinions about the other side. The same goes for the readers. They'll be exposed to different ideas, and even if that doesn't change their minds, they might walk away with a better understanding of the other side, especially if the books are created by people who actually hold those views. That doesn't mean that anyone has to turn Marvel or DC into Fox News or the Daily Wire. Switching out far-left politics for right-wing politics only inverts the situation. And while some people think that might be better, go and read some of the comics from the late 50s just after the CCA took over, cause it ain't. The real solution is adding in people with different perspectives because every book shouldn't come from the same political origin. You don't have to like those books. You don't have to read them. You don't have to agree with the characters. But you do need to see that every character, and every creator for that matter, doesn't have to follow your views, and there's nothing wrong with that. But what do I know? I'm just some guy.